Pressure is mounting to regulate the railroads. The Grangers, they're coming up next, has forced several states to pass state laws to regulate the railroad. And in 1886, the Wabash case rules that railroads are interstate commerce and can't be regulated by the states, but only can be regulated by the federal government. This is going to be really important because now that fight is going to move to the federal level. Congress will ultimately cave into the farmers when they form their own political party and start winning elections in 1887 and create the Interstate Commerce Act. This bans price discrimination, meaning you have to charge everyone the same prices to use the train. It requires train schedules to be publicly posted, and it requires that prices be reasonable and just. The 5-person Interstate Commerce Commission becomes the first regulatory body in American history. There's a whole lot of these now, but they begin here in the 1880s with the ICC. But they rely on the courts for enforcement. The ICC can't do anything to you. All they can do is sue you, and then the courts decide who's right. And so consequently, like the Sherman Antitrust Act, it has no real impact and doesn't limit the corporations at all because the courts are extremely pro-corporate. But later, once the courts begin to change, who the judges are begins to change, it will have a significant impact. Let's take a look at this Grange or this agrarian revolt. Farmers, feeling left behind both by political parties, advanced technology, urbanization, all that stuff, will strike back with a political party of their own. The first formal attempt to organize farmers was the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, created in 1867. It was actually created to spread scientific agriculture, to teach farmers how to use the new methods and technology that was changing farming. But the 1873 Depression bolstered membership and changed the direction of the organization. Midwestern Grangers began to form co-ops and try to regulate railroads and warehouse monopolies. Co-ops are where the farmers own it, so they may set up a warehouse that's not owned by a private company. It's owned by the farmers themselves, and therefore the rates would be much cheaper and more friendly. Through election, members of the Grange were able to take control of most legislatures in the Midwestern United States, and they're going to pass railroad regulations. But of course, as I mentioned just a minute ago, these are struck down by the courts, who rule that this is a federal issue, not a state issue. The Grange fades as the recession lifts, and there's less need for these sorts of things. We really tend to only do anything when times are bad. When times are good, we kind of ignore all the problems until times get bad again. That's how we are. In 1875, the Southern farmers create the Farmers Alliance. By 1880, it has over 4 million members. The Grange is replaced by the Northwest Alliance in the Midwest. And these form co-ops, banks, stores, processing plants, and the whole goal is to make it so farmers don't have to deal with private businesses. So farmers can collectively own these things. I mean, this is essentially socialism. So they won't get price gouged and taken advantage of by corporations. Not really how we think politically of rural America today, but that's the way it was. Co-ops didn't always work well due to inexperience and attempts by capitalists to destroy them. They would either try to get rules or regulations to get rid of them, or come in and open up businesses, undercut the prices to kill them. They didn't like it because if the farmer was using a co-op, he wasn't using them. In 1889, the two farmers' alliances, the Southern and the Midwest, joined in a loose alliance. And they actually have a convention in 1890 at Ocala, Florida. And in Ocala, Florida, they list the Ocala demands, which I'll get to in a minute. In 1890, Farmers Alliance candidates take control of 12 state legislatures, 6 governor's mansions, 3 senators. They elect 3 senators and 50 members of the House of Representatives. Now, they didn't necessarily run on what was called the Populist Party. Much like the Tea Party recently, they would usually run as Democrats, but then identify themselves as populist Democrats. In the summer of 1892, they did actually form a formal political party, the People's Party, or the Populist Party. They held their convention in Omaha, Nebraska, and nominated James B. Weaver from Iowa as their presidential candidate. They got over 1 million votes in the 1892 election. They were a significant force. They won more than 1,500 state legislature seats, 3 more governorships, 5 senators, and 10 more congressmen. And candidates began to identify themselves as populist, even if they weren't in the People's Party. So you had now both Democrats and Republicans who would identify themselves as being populist candidates because the movement was just that powerful. This was small farmers. Large farmers weren't interested in this. This was small farmers, regular people. They courted labor, city labor. I mean, they tried to form an alliance between the farmers and the laborers, but they often opposed each other on other issues, particularly issues where city people felt differently about things than country people. They also briefly accepted the 1.25 million farmers in the Colored Alliance. These were black farmers, of course, but the southern part of the Farmers Alliance was very uncomfortable with this, and in a short period of time, they're going to kick them out and refuse to let them be in there. This is always the problem with organizational movements, is that these hatreds, these pre-existing hatreds, often short-circuit them. So let's talk about what they wanted. Well, the Ocala demands that they drafted in 1890 in Florida will ask for government-owned sub-treasuries. And these are warehouses where farmers can leave crops to sit when prices are low and wait for prices to come up and then sell the crops then. But they would get paid the low price when they left the crop there, and then they could come back later, sell it, repay basically what was a loan, and then get the new higher price. They wanted to end nationally chartered banks because they saw the banks as in a conspiracy against them. They were right, by the way. The banks were fixing the rates. It was a complete oligopoly conspiracy against them. They wanted an end to absentee loanership. They wanted to end the idea that you could rent your land out to another farmer. Or a corporation could buy land and rent it out to a farmer. They wanted the direct election of senators, which they're going to get. They wanted the regulation of railroads, telegraphs, and telephones, which they're also going to get, because they were being price gouged by these monopolies. They wanted a government-run savings bank. It was called a postal savings bank. So they could store their money and save their money in a bank that they trusted, unlike the corporate banks who were taking advantage of them. They wanted a graduated income tax. So poor people were taxed less than rich people. They wanted, by the way, primary source of revenue for the government at this point was the tariff, which hurt them to some extent because they were buying imported goods, but taxes on alcohol, which are very regressive, meaning that poor people pay a higher percentage of their income than rich people, and that would upset them. They wanted inflation. You probably think of inflation as the worst thing in the world. Farmers wanted inflation because they were borrowing money, and then when they paid it back, if there was a lot of inflation, the money they paid back was worth less than what they borrowed. They were also seeing their crop prices decline steadily. And so their money, which was basically in crops, was inflating, but the regular currency wasn't. And so they actually wanted inflation. Well, how do you get inflation? They wanted America to start coining silver. At that point, all our money was based on gold. Well, if we added silver to the mix, we could coin a lot more money, and increase in the money supply leads to inflation. Now, they had some problems. They were largely anti-Semitic. They didn't like Jews. They saw the Jews as being in control of the banks. They were anti-intellectual. They did not like science and all this newfangled learning and Darwinism and that sort of stuff. They didn't like the East much at all. And they didn't like cities. And so there were a lot of prejudices kind of baked into this movement. They rejected a capitalist, laissez-faire, free market economy, which is kind of funny if you think about the way we perceive things today. They wanted more government intervention to help them. And they were the most significant and important challenge to capitalism in the Gilded Age.